Welcome to video number 3, Missionary Service and Mental Illness. Now, why? Isn't that the question you want to ask? Why would the Lord allow someone to return home before finishing the expected 18 to 24 months? Someone who has desired with all their heart to serve the Lord, who has been faithful and true to gospel principles. I certainly don't have every answer because I believe that some of them will not be known until after this live. But what I do hope is that by the end of this video, you will see the question differently, and that you might see why the Lord have allowed you or someone you know to return honorably and earlier than expected. Now, this video is a little bit long, but stick with me. So to begin this episode, there are some things that I'm going to have to state right up front. This is going to be about my own experience and a little bit about my daughter who had clinical depression and actually was later diagnosed with bipolar. First, before my mission, I was an undiagnosed, moderate, and sometimes severe rapid cycling bipolar. As I've said before, there were rumblings in the back of my head that something was wrong, and that leads me to my second confession. That is, up to my mission, I had never known life without bipolar. So in many ways, I thought I was actually quite normal. Third, I rarely talk about my mission. Not because there were not great moments, but I assume because of the moments that were downright difficult and painful. I was never one to really break rules, so that was not an issue. But some of the deep depressions and trauma that came with it left a lasting mark. Some might refer to it as a type of coping mechanism, or PTSD-induced amnesia. In any case, I have not made contact with anyone from my mission since I left it. Don't get me wrong. I had great companions, and I still remember many of their names to this day. I remember both of my mission presidents reasonably well. I had good experiences, but the emotional trauma left behind was very real to me, and I believe somewhere deep subconsciously, I didn't and don't desire to relive it. The trauma was not necessarily caused by any exterior forces acting upon me, but rather the effects of a mental illness under the pressures and requirements of missionary life. There is nothing wrong with the pressures and the requirements of missionary life, and they are necessary for missionaries to accomplish the work they need to do. The work is daunting, exacting, exhausting, and very rewarding if done right and when the body allows for it. However, portions of the work do not mix well with mental illness, including anxiety, bipolar, and depression. The high levels of stress, combined with constant change of companions and environment, coupled with the consistent need to form new relationships and talk to strangers, are in direct contrast to the emotional stability needed to treat the disease effectively. So in essence, two of the major factors often used in treating the disease, keeping stability in relationships and emotional connections, and consistency in the environmental factors, reducing stress, become compromised by the nature of missionary work. So today I'm going to talk about some of the most pressing questions that often come to individuals who experience mental illness during their missionary service. It is important to remember that mental illness does not have one single cause, and that the cause of mental illness is what needs to be treated for a long-term recovery. So here are the questions that I will address today. Why does the Lord allow individuals to experience mental illness during their missionary service? And what value does that provide to anyone, including companions, members, and investigators? 2, why doesn't the Lord just heal the individual or to remove the disease for the length of the missionary service, or at least diminish it to the point that it doesn't affect the missionary? Now, number 3, can a missionary still effectively serve with a mental illness? Or should we assume that if a potential missionary is afflicted or becomes afflicted with mental illness, full-time proselyting service is really not an option? Is it really insufficient faith in the Lord to heal me? Or is there something else at work? I know that the questions are perhaps the ones that we have been discussing in the church since mental illness was really recognized. I can tell you that I've never really seen or heard anything specifically related to missionary service and mental illness, although I have no doubt that there's something out there and perhaps more than I realize. So here are some of my conclusions from my particular experience, and then I'm going to directly answer the questions posed earlier. 1, I was never really a stellar or standout missionary with the illness, but I wasn't rendered ineffective by it. The Lord worked with what I had to give and provided for the remainder. Mission rules weren't really exceedingly difficult for me, except for the work hours and instability of the relationships, which often exhausted my body and really caused a high level of stress to occur, which that exacerbated the symptoms. Now, the pressures of missionary life, relationship building, goal setting, attainment, changing environments, culture, and other more pure missionary pressures to succeed did often cause my illness to intensify in many ways. Something I do believe is that if I had been diagnosed, is that I would have had more tools at my disposal to manage the symptoms more effectively. Although I really don't know whether it would have helped. I do have to assume that it would have, but my diagnosis would likely have changed my missionary assignment, and that would have been devastating to me at the time. I simply didn't understand the nature of missionary assignments, as Elder Bednar had explained in his conference talk. Now, I did note that while I was teaching lessons, the Spirit would often remove, or perhaps better said, cover the symptoms during the teaching time frame and for maybe even a few hours afterward. But we did not consistently teach lessons and were often tracting. Now, tracting door to door, knocking, talking to new people, approaching strangers, and building relationships seemed to cause significant stress for me. Stress is really one of the main treatment concerns in the illness, and it affected me greatly. Boiled down to a few simple ideas, missionary service becomes increasingly difficult based on the nature and the development of mental illness. If the illness is undiagnosed or is left untreated, it can often and will render the missionary without the ability to do the work in an effective manner. However, with good treatment and constant vigilance in the mission, I believe that it's very possible for an individual to effectively serve and complete the mission in the expected time frame. Note that I said possible and that it is important. Even with diagnosis, treatment, and vigilance, some individuals still will return home, having completed their mission, but not in the expected time frame. Now, to the questions. Why does the Lord allow individuals to experience mental illness during their missionary service? What value does that provide to anyone, including the companions, members, investigators? Now, when I see this question, it always leads me to the broader question as to why the Lord would allow anyone to have a mental illness at any time in their life or any severely disabling illness. What benefits would that particular illness provide for anyone? Lesson 1, and this is probably one of the more important ones, is humility. I needed to be brought to my knees regularly so that the Lord could teach me. Not sure what this exactly says about my nature and pride, but in some ways I suppose it's true for all of us. We simply are not as diligent when the sun is shining and the birds are singing. We need trials in our lives to be able to rise to the nature of our Father in heaven. I don't believe that we can obtain celestial life without trials and chastisement. The power of the natural man is often very enticing for us to remember the Lord, and perhaps I needed this more than others. Not that I would say this is true for everyone who has the illness, for I believe that many have the illness and still would be very diligent without it, but I do know that the chastisement brings a level of development we can have, or spiritual development we can have in no other way. Now, why does the Lord allow for this to occur during missionary service, even to the point that someone returns earlier than the expected time frame? Wouldn't we all be better served having served a full-time proselyting mission? Now, given my experience with my own daughter, who returned for that exact reason, and knowing of her great desire to serve her whole entire life, I can say no. I know that the Lord allowed her to return home, and that was the right thing for her and for her salvation. It seems a little strange to think that returning home would be for her salvation and eternal progression, but I know that it was. Returning home before the completed time was more important to her progression than serving the people of Iowa. The Lord was in it. Has it been difficult for her? Absolutely. Has it driven her to her knees? Probably too many times to count. Did she still have to go to counseling? She did. But was it right in the Lord's eyes? Yes, it was. And that was confirmed to everyone involved in the decision. There was no condemnation. There was no sin. She had done what the Lord needed her to do. Will we ever fully know why? All of the reasons that it contributed to her salvation? I would say yes, but probably not in this life. She will need to be content that it was the Lord who made the decision, and she just followed where he led. My second answer is that the Lord allows natural processes to occur. We each have a disposition within us that allows for only a certain level of stress and disconnectedness emotionally before we experience mental illness. When we reach our tolerance point, the illness will emerge, and the Lord allows for these processes to occur naturally in each of us as weaknesses to teach us valuable principles of salvation. So my final answer is that we are unlikely in this life to fully understand all of the why of it. Remember, the Lord sees our eternity, not just this life, and plans for the eternity. We only see a small window of time, and even with that small window, we probably don't see very well. I believe that sometimes the Lord simply couldn't explain it to us if he tried. So he assures us that it was all in his plans, and we have to trust that what he does is best for us. Now, why doesn't the Lord just heal the individual or remove the disease for the length of the missionary service? I will admit that this is probably the underlying question in almost every case of somebody returning home for an illness of really any type. I think that I could reiterate much of what I've just said, but other things can be learned from the illness, such as increased faith, determination, endurance, patience, adaptability, and really so much more. I think we've gotten into the habit of thinking that missionary service is the pinnacle of what a young person can accomplish, that nothing can replace long-term service as a missionary. I believe that in some ways we actually think of it as a rite of passage to celestial life. If you don't have this full-time enduring service, you are somewhat less qualified to be a bishop, a stake president, or a leader of any kind. I believe that we believe it to be a commitment to the Lord and an unbreakable bond that we should fulfill under any circumstance. Underlying all of these notions is the idea that anyone unable to serve or who returns due to mental illness or illness in some ways is weak, both in faith and testimony. And they had to put their mind to it that they would have accomplished it. I shudder to think what the Lord feels about this type of underlying judgment. The harm we do in thinking this way about any type of calling, especially missionary work or service, can be devastating to the individual and the calling itself. While we should not choose to break the promise by sin or other means we have made, the Lord has the right to say when the service is complete at any time without reservation and without comment from those who do not understand the situation or the Lord's will. We cannot see what the Lord sees and what his work for each of his children. And to say that the Lord would never shorten a call for his purposes is wrong at its very core and denies revelation, the omniscience of God, and the love of his children. If the Lord could, I am certain that he would allow for every one of his children to serve a full-length proselyting mission. But he cannot do that and still save his children as he so desires. So the length of the mission is determined by the Lord. And if sickness isn't healed, then that is the plan. And we must adjust to the Lord's will. End of story. So for those of you who have served and returned early, know that the Lord was in it, and that it was part of your salvation, and perhaps that of others. Question number 3. Can a missionary still effectively serve a mission with a mental illness? Or should we assume that if a potential missionary has had or currently does have a mental illness, full-time proselyting service is really not an option? Now, I firmly believe that a missionary can serve with the illness, and the Lord can temper the illness as much as he tempered the weather in the Salt Lake Valley for the pioneers. So my answer is a firm yes. Does this mean you could go off your medications, counseling, and other treatments and not concern yourself for the welfare of your body and mind? Well, of course not. The Lord requires that we do all we can, and then he will provide the rest. So a missionary would have to take special care so that the illness was well managed during the missionary service. Now, would this diminish their ability to serve? Maybe or maybe not, but it isn't. But isn't it the Lord that states several times in the Doctrine and Covenants that the weak things of the earth would thrash the strong and mighty? Weakness comes in many forms, and mental illness is one of those forms. The most important matter is to allow the Lord to choose and then accept his will and decision, and then go forth rejoicing, knowing that you are doing what the Lord wants, whether that is to serve or not to serve, or to serve for only a time, or to serve a service mission. Question number 4, and this is important. Is it just really insufficient faith in the Lord to heal me if I return early? Or is there something else at work? I've come to believe that this is another of the unwritten sentiments in the church that is simply false. Do some people lack faith to be healed? Yes, the Doctrine and Covenants says that there are some. But I believe that a majority of the people under covenant in the church have sufficient faith to be healed. This assumes that you're doing the things you should be, such as prayer and study and other essential daily spiritual habits. I would doubt that anyone who has been called to as a missionary lacks this faith. It has been my experience that, for the most part, they do not. Even given that statement, it's important to remember that something else about faith. Elder Bednar once recalled a story about a man who was dying of cancer, and a question had come to his mind that he had never thought about before, and it really strikes to the core of this answer. His question to the man was, did he have faith not to be healed? While this might seem counterintuitive to need faith not to be healed, I believe that the intent of the question was that if the Lord decided not to heal you, would your faith in the Savior decrease? Would you lose testimony and the witness you have if he were to say, I am not going to heal you, and that is going to cause you to return home? Or would your testimony remain intact? Could you have sufficient faith to honorably return home before the expected time frame and maintain your testimony of the Savior and his church? If I believe that the Lord often does not heal us to help us learn this level of faith, trust, and maturity, a much higher level of faith, trust, and maturity. So if you are not healed and return home to continue your life, understand that the Lord has deemed you worthy to be tested in more mature and difficult ways. It is not the development of faith to be healed, but the development of faith not to be healed that provides for exaltation. It is easy to accept the Lord's will when the blessing comes, but when it does not, we learn of our true nature. Learning maturity in the gospel, trust in the Lord, and understanding of his methods of salvation and exaltation are really key elements to exaltation. Now that is the end for today. As always, the Lord requires the fight, then he can do the rest. So do your part so that the Lord can do his. We will talk to you next time.